You always take her side, my son said, shoving his chair back from the table so hard it toppled over, and before I could even answer him, his wife's hand came across the table and knocked my coffee mug straight into my lap, the scalding liquid soaking through my slacks and searing my thigh before it hit the floor and shattered. I sat there for a second, feeling the heat spread across my leg, watching the brown stain bloom across Helen's old tablecloth, the one with the little embroidered daisies she'd stitched herself back when her hand still worked right. And here's the part none of them understood as they stood there staring at me. I laughed. Not a big laugh, just a short, quiet one that seemed to confuse everybody in that kitchen more than if I'd shouted back. I stood up slowly, walked to the hall closet, and pulled my jacket off the hook. Because what none of them knew, sitting there in stunned silence, was that I had been waiting for a moment exactly like this one for almost 4 months. My name is Walter Grantham. I'm 66 years old, and I spent 34 years working as a machinist and then a shop foreman at a manufacturing plant outside Dayton, Ohio, before I retired 8 years ago. This is the story of the night my daughter-in-law scalded me with hot coffee at my own kitchen table, and why, instead of getting angry, I got calmer than I'd been in months, because calm was the only thing that was ever going to win. I live alone in a two-story brick house on Maple Crest Drive, the same house my wife Dorothy and I bought back in 1987 when our son Kevin was just a toddler learning to walk on the hardwood in the living room. Dorothy passed away almost 5 years ago now, congestive heart failure, and the house has never felt the same since. Too quiet most days, except when the grandkids come by, which hasn't happened nearly enough lately. Kevin is 36, married to a woman named Chelsea for going on 6 years, and together they have two children, Owen, who is 7, and Maddie, who just turned 5. Upstairs, there are two extra bedrooms that used to belong to Kevin and his older sister Renee when they were growing up. Renee lives out in Colorado now, hardly ever visits, but those two rooms have sat mostly untouched since the kids moved out, except for a fold-out couch, some old boxes of Dorothy's craft supplies, and a treadmill I never use as much as I promised myself I would. About 7 months before any of this happened, Chelsea's younger brother, Tyler, lost his apartment in Columbus after getting laid off from a warehouse job and falling 3 months behind on rent. He moved in with Chelsea's parents for a while, but that arrangement fell apart fast. Something about Tyler and his stepfather not getting along, shouting matches, the police getting called once over a broken window. I didn't know all the details at the time. I just knew Chelsea had started mentioning Tyler more and more at every family dinner, always in this careful, testing kind of voice, watching my face closely for a reaction each time she brought him up. And each time, I felt something tighten in my chest that I couldn't quite name yet, a feeling that got sharper every single time Chelsea wandered upstairs during a visit and lingered a little too long near those two empty bedrooms. About 3 months before the coffee, I sat down with an old friend of mine from the plant, a woman named Patricia Voss who'd gone back to school later in life and become an estate attorney over in Kettering. I told her what I'd been noticing, the comments, the long looks at the upstairs rooms, the way Chelsea had started referring to my house as so much space for just one person, like it was a problem that needed solving. Patricia didn't laugh it off or tell me I was imagining things. She told me to document everything, keep my will updated and airtight, and to call her the second anything crossed from uncomfortable conversation into something worse. We joked, a little grimly, about calling it my insurance policy. I didn't think I'd actually need it. I was wrong about that. 2 weeks before it happened, Kevin called me on a Sunday afternoon while I was out in the garage, sanding down an old dresser that used to be Dorothy's. He had that particular tone in his voice, the one he used to get as a teenager right before asking to borrow the truck for something he knew I'd say no to if he asked straight out. "Dad," he said, "Chelsea and I were thinking, since it's almost Thanksgiving anyway, maybe we could all get together at your place this year. Make it a real family thing. I have everybody together." I told him that sounded nice, and I meant it, because it did sound nice on the surface, and there was no reason in my mind to say no to hosting Thanksgiving, like I used to when Dorothy was still here. What I didn't know then was that Chelsea had already decided, weeks earlier, that Thanksgiving at my house, surrounded by family, with everybody watching, would be the perfect setting to finally push the question about Tyler moving in. Figuring a full table of people would make it harder for me to say no outright. I found all that out much later. At the time, I was just a lonely old man, glad his grandkids were finally coming around again, spending the better part of a week getting the house ready, buying a turkey too big for the number of people coming, and pulling Dorothy's good china down from the top shelf of the cabinet, the set she only ever used for holidays, because some habits just don't go away, even after the person who started them is gone. Thanksgiving morning came in cold and gray, typical for late November in Ohio, with that damp kind of chill that gets into your bones no matter how many layers you put on. Kevin, Chelsea, and the kids showed up first around 11, and Chelsea's parents, Frank and Donna Marsh, arrived about half an hour later with Tyler riding along in the back seat of their car, which caught me off guard right away since nobody had mentioned he'd be coming. Owen and Maddie ran straight for the backyard to see if I still had the old tire swing hanging from the oak tree, and for a little while, watching them out there laughing in the cold, it actually felt like a real holiday again, the kind Dorothy and I used to host every year without even trying hard. Donna complimented the china and asked me about my years at the plant, and Frank talked football with Kevin out on the back porch while I basted the turkey, and for a couple of hours, I let myself believe maybe I really had been overthinking the whole thing. Dinner started around 2 in the afternoon. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, green beans, the whole spread laid out across the dining table with Dorothy's china set just the way she used to arrange it. The kids ate at a smaller card table by the window, while the adults sat around the main table, Tyler included, which still felt strange to me, having a near stranger sitting in what used to be Renee's old chair. About halfway through the meal, Chelsea set her fork down and looked slowly around the dining room, the same unhurried, appraising look she'd been giving my upstairs hallway for months. "This house really is something, Walter," she said. "All this room, and it's just you rattling around in it most days, isn't it?" I said something simple back. Agreed. It probably was more space than one person needed, not thinking too much of it in the moment. Kevin glanced over at Chelsea across the table. A quick look I caught, but didn't fully understand yet. Frank cleared his throat and started talking about the Bengals game instead, which felt a little too convenient to be an accident. I didn't know it then, but that was the calm settling in right before the part of the day I would never be able to forget. Dessert hadn't come out yet, when Chelsea set her wine glass down harder than she needed to, and said what she'd clearly been working up to, saying all through dinner. "Walter," she said, "Tyler's been through a really rough stretch, and you've got 2 whole bedrooms upstairs just sitting there empty. I really think it makes sense for him to stay here for a little while, just until he gets back on his feet." The table went quiet except for Owen laughing at something Maddie said at the little table across the room. I set my own fork down slowly and told her I understood Tyler was going through something hard, and I meant that, honestly, but that my home wasn't a solution to somebody else's housing trouble, and I wasn't comfortable turning a guest room into a long-term living situation for a young man I barely knew. Chelsea's expression shifted fast, the polite mask from earlier slipping right off. "It's not forever, Walter," she said, her voice sharpening. "It's just until he saves up. Those rooms just sit up there doing nothing while my brother sleeps on my parents' pull-out couch." Kevin jumped in then, trying to sound reasonable but landing somewhere closer to pleading. "Dad, come on. It's not that big a deal. He's basically family at this point." I looked at my son, at the boy I'd taught to ride a bike in this very driveway, and told him as steady as I could manage that it was still my house and my decision, and the answer right now was no. Frank and Donna sat there looking uncomfortable, Donna's eyes fixed on her plate, Frank shifting like he wanted to be anywhere else. I don't believe they'd asked for this argument to happen at my table, and looking back, I still believe that. But Chelsea wasn't finished, and neither, it turned out, was Kevin. Kevin stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the hardwood and toppled backward onto the floor. He pointed a finger at me the way I used to point a finger at him back when he was 17 and missed curfew. "You always take her side," he said, loud enough that I heard the kids go quiet at the other table. "This whole house, all this space, just for you, and you won't lift a finger to help somebody who actually needs it." I told him to lower his voice, that there were children in the house, but he kept right on going, telling me I'd always been this way, always stubborn, always making things harder than they needed to be. Chelsea chimed in right behind him, her voice rising to match his. "You have 2 empty bedrooms, Walter," she said, nearly shouting now. "Rooms just sitting there collecting dust while my little brother has nowhere decent to sleep. And you won't even think about it for 1 second." I stayed in my seat. I stayed calm, because 34 years running, a shop floor full of grown men with tempers, had taught me that raising my own voice back only ever made things worse, never better. I told them both, evenly, that the conversation was over, that my house wasn't up for debate at my own dinner table, and that if Tyler needed help, we could talk about other options that didn't involve him moving in under my roof. That was when Chelsea reached for her coffee mug instead of her wine glass, the one I just refilled from the pot on the sideboard, still steaming, and swept it hard across the table. dumping it straight into my lap and knocking it to the floor where it shattered against the hardwood. The coffee soaked through my slacks instantly, scalding hot against my thigh, and I felt the sting travel up before I even fully registered what had happened. The room went dead silent, except for Maddie's small voice from the other table asking what was wrong. For a few full seconds, nobody at that table moved. Chelsea's hand hung there in the air over the table where the mug had been, her mouth open like she couldn't quite believe what she'd just done. Kevin stood frozen beside his overturned chair, his face draining of color as he watched the brown stains spreading across Dorothy's tablecloth and down the front of my shirt. Frank and Donna both pushed back from the table fast, Donna's hand flying up to cover her mouth, Frank already grabbing a stack of napkins and shoving them toward me, even though nobody had asked. I looked down at the burn already reddening on my leg, felt the wet heat soaking through the fabric against my skin, and then I did something that seemed to confuse every single person sitting at that table. I laughed. Not loud, not dramatic, just a short, quiet sound, almost to myself. Because in that exact moment, sitting there, burned and humiliated at my own Thanksgiving table, I understood with total clarity that everything I'd quietly put in place over the last 3 months had just become necessary, and I no longer had to wonder whether I'd been overreacting to any of it. "Dad," Kevin said, his voice cracking, "are you okay?" "She didn't mean to. It was an accident," and I held up my hand to stop him without saying a single word back. I stood up slowly from the table, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled my jacket and my car keys off the hook by the door, pressing a folded dish towel against my thigh the whole time to ease the burn. "Where are you going?" Kevin called after me, his voice caught somewhere between panic and confusion. I told him I was heading to urgent care, and that he should stay behind and look after his family and his guests. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't point any fingers or accuse anybody of anything out loud. I just walked out my own front door with a coffee-soaked towel pressed against my leg and got into my truck in the driveway, while my son stood frozen in the doorway behind me, still holding a fistful of useless napkins, still not understanding what he'd just set into motion. The drive to the urgent care clinic over on Wilmington Pike took about 13 minutes, and I remember every single one of them clearly. I kept the towel pressed against my thigh with one hand and drove carefully with the other, steadier than I probably had any right to be given the circumstances. At a red light on Far Hills Avenue, I dug my phone out of my jacket pocket with my free hand and typed out a short text to Patricia Voss, the attorney who'd been quietly preparing right alongside me for months without either of us knowing exactly when it would finally be needed. The message was only 4 words. Step 1 is done. I want to be clear about what that meant, because it wasn't some dramatic line from a movie. It was simple and it was practical. 3 months earlier, after noticing the growing pattern of comments about my house and my empty bedrooms, I'd gone to Patricia and asked her plainly what my options were if things ever escalated past just uncomfortable dinner conversation. She'd explained that guilt trips and emotional pressure, ugly as they are, don't carry any weight in a courtroom. But if something ever turned physical, even something that seemed small, like a mug of hot coffee swept off a table, that would be an entirely different matter, one with real, legal consequences attached to it. We agreed that if that day ever came, my very first move, before calling her, before calling anyone else, was to get myself seen by a medical professional and have the injury documented properly. Because a medical record made in the moment holds a kind of honesty that memories and arguments later on simply can't match. Step 1 was never about revenge for its own sake. It was about making sure that if my family ever crossed a line they couldn't take back, there'd be an honest, time-stamped record of exactly what happened, starting from the second it happened. I walked into the urgent care clinic, with the towel still pressed against my leg, my slacks soaked through, and clinging uncomfortably to the burn underneath, and a young man at the front desk named Marcus took one look at me and had me back in an exam room within 5 minutes. A physician's assistant named Dana Okafor, calm and quick with her hands, examined the burn and told me it covered a patch about 4 inches across on my upper thigh. A second-degree burn that would need dressing and careful monitoring, but thankfully wouldn't need skin grafting. As she cleaned and dressed the wound, she asked the routine questions, how it happened, whether I felt safe at home, and I answered her honestly, telling her my daughter-in-law had swept a mug of hot coffee into my lap during an argument at Thanksgiving dinner. Her expression didn't change much, but I could tell by the careful, practiced way she kept asking follow-up questions that she'd heard versions of this story before and knew exactly where it was likely headed. She explained gently that clinic policy required her to notify local police whenever a patient came in with an injury caused intentionally by another person, particularly in a case that looked like it involved a family or domestic dispute, and that an officer would probably want to take a statement from me before I left. I told her that was fine, that I understood completely, and if I'm honest, some small part of me had already expected exactly that outcome. While she finished dressing the burn, I sat there thinking about Dorothy, wondering how she would have handled a scene like that one, and decided she probably would have thrown that same mug right back across the table if she'd had half a second to react, which nearly made me laugh out loud again right there in the exam room. About 25 minutes later, a Kettering police officer walked into my little curtained area, notepad already open, ready to hear my account of what had happened at that dinner table. His name was Officer Reyes, a stocky man in his 40s with a slow, patient way of asking questions that told me right away this wasn't his first time taking a report like mine. He asked me to walk him through the whole afternoon from the start, and I did, keeping my voice level and my facts straight, not exaggerating a single detail and not leaving anything important out either. I told him about the request to let Tyler move into my house, about my refusal, about Kevin and Chelsea raising their voices at the table, and about Chelsea sweeping her coffee mug directly into my lap in front of everyone at that table, including her own parents and my two young grandchildren sitting close enough to see it happen. Officer Reyes wrote it all down, occasionally stopping to ask a clarifying question, like exactly where I'd been sitting, how far Chelsea's hand had traveled, whether the motion looked like a deliberate sweep or something closer to an accidental bump during an argument. I told him honestly that it looked intentional to me, that she'd reached for the mug and shoved it hard across the table, rather than knocking it over by accident while gesturing. He nodded, told me this would be filed as a report for assault, and said he'd be following up with Chelsea directly to get her account of what happened as well. My phone kept buzzing in my jacket pocket the entire time he was writing, Kevin's name flashing across the screen over and over. I didn't answer a single call, not out of spite, but because I genuinely didn't know yet what I wanted to say, and I didn't want to say something I'd regret while everything was still so fresh and raw. Officer Reyes handed me his card before he left, told me to call if I remembered any other details, and said someone from the department would be in touch about next steps. That same evening, while I sat at home with a fresh bandage on my leg and an ice pack I probably didn't need anymore, Officer Reyes and his partner drove out to Kevin and Chelsea's place to get her side of the story. Standard procedure whenever a report like mine gets filed. I heard how that conversation went a couple days later, partly from Kevin and partly from Patricia, who'd had her own contacts check on the status of things. From what I understood, Chelsea tried to explain the whole thing as an accident, insisting she'd only been gesturing emphatically during a heated conversation and the mug had simply slipped out of her hand. The trouble for her was that explanation didn't line up with what three other adults at that table had already told the officer earlier that same evening, since Reyes had also taken brief statements from Frank, Donna, and even Kevin before I ever left for the clinic. All three of them, Kevin included, confirmed Chelsea had reached out and swept the mug deliberately, not dropped it or knocked it accidentally. Officer Reyes told her plainly that the burn, the matching eyewitness accounts, and the fact that hot coffee had traveled clean across the table rather than simply spilling near her own place setting didn't support an accidental explanation, and that the report would move forward as an assault charge for the prosecutor's office to review. I'm told Chelsea cried through most of that conversation, going back and forth between calling it an accident and asking what this would mean for her now that she had two young kids at home depending on her. Kevin, from what he told me himself later, stood in the kitchen through the whole thing, barely saying a word, still trying to process how one argument about house guests had turned into two police officers standing in his living room on Thanksgiving night. Over the next several days, my phone rang constantly, mostly Kevin, occasionally Chelsea, the voicemail swinging wildly between apology and quiet defensiveness depending on who was calling and what hour it was. I let most of them go straight to voicemail while I focused on healing up and on meeting with Patricia to figure out what came next, because step one had only ever been the beginning, never the whole plan. Sitting in Patricia's office about a week after Thanksgiving, we talked through my options carefully and without rushing. I told her I had no interest in dragging this out for years or punishing anybody beyond whatever the legal system decided was appropriate for what had actually happened that day. But I also told her plainly that I was done being treated like a housing solution or an inconvenience by people who were supposed to love me more than that. Patricia suggested we move forward on two fronts at once. First, a temporary protective order, giving both Kevin's household and me some legally enforced space and cooling off time while the assault charge worked its way through the system. Second, and this mattered more to me personally than anything else, restructuring my estate so that the house and my savings would go directly into a trust for Owen and Maddie's future education, administered by Patricia herself rather than by Kevin or Chelsea, with me keeping full control and use of everything for as long as I was alive to use it. This was never about punishing my grandchildren, and it wasn't about cutting Kevin out of my life for good either. It was about making absolutely certain that nobody could ever again treat my home, my safety, or my finances like something up for negotiation at a dinner table, using guilt and pressure instead of basic respect. Patricia filed the paperwork within the week, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was finally steering my own life again instead of just bracing for whatever came next. About 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, against Patricia's advice and honestly against my own better judgment too, I let Kevin and Chelsea come by the house to talk things through in person. The bandage had come off my leg by then, leaving a shiny pink patch of healing skin that Dana had told me would fade over time but probably never disappear entirely. Chelsea looked like she hadn't slept properly in days, and Kevin looked worse than that. The two of them sat stiffly on my living room couch while I sat across from them in Dorothy's old reading chair by the window. Chelsea apologized first, her voice shaking, saying she never meant to actually hurt me, that she'd just been so overwhelmed watching her brother struggle for months, and it all came out sideways at the absolute worst possible moment. I told her I believed she regretted it now, but that regret didn't undo what had happened, and that throwing or sweeping something at another person, especially hot enough to burn skin, was never an acceptable way to handle a disagreement, no matter how frustrated somebody felt in the moment. Kevin tried to jump in, asking if there was any way I could talk to the prosecutor's office and make the whole charge quietly disappear, and I told him plainly that this wasn't something I controlled anymore, that the state was handling it now, and Chelsea would need to face whatever the legal process decided was fair, same as anybody else in her position would. I also told them both about the trust I'd set up for Owen and Maddie, explaining calmly that it wasn't punishment. It was simply me protecting my home and my money for my grandchildren's future, instead of leaving it sitting there as something to be argued over during holiday dinners. Kevin went quiet for a long stretch, staring down at the carpet, and I could see something shifting behind his eyes, somewhere between shame and finally understanding exactly what his family had lost sight of over these last several months. Chelsea's court date came about 9 weeks later, and since this was her first offense with no prior record, the prosecutor's office offered her a plea deal instead of pushing the case to a full trial. She pleaded guilty to assault, and the judge sentenced her to 50 hours of community service, a modest fine, and 4 months of mandatory anger management classes, along with the protective order Patricia had already put in place, staying active for that same stretch of time. It wasn't some dramatic courtroom scene out of a television drama, just a quiet, practical outcome that matched what had actually happened that day. An outcome I honestly believed was fair, given everything. I didn't attend the hearing myself, choosing instead to spend that afternoon out in the garage, finally finishing the sanding on Dorothy's old dresser, since Patricia told me my written statement to the court had already said everything that needed saying on my behalf. Word travels fast in a neighborhood like mine, and I was genuinely surprised by how many people reached out over the following weeks. My next-door neighbor, Ruth, brought over a casserole one evening just to check in on me without making a big production of it. An old buddy from the plant floor called to make sure I was doing all right after hearing a secondhand version of the story through the grapevine. Nobody made me feel foolish for what had happened, and nobody suggested I'd overreacted by getting the police and the courts involved, which honestly meant more to me than I expected it would going in. Tyler, through a workforce reentry program that Patricia actually helped connect Frank and Donna with, ended up landing a warehouse supervisor job over in Springfield a few months later, one that came with an employee housing stipend that let him get his own small apartment near the job site. Turned out there'd been a reasonable path forward for him all along, one that never needed to involve guilt, hot coffee, or my spare bedrooms at all. By the following spring, things between Kevin and me had started, slowly and carefully, to settle into a new kind of normal. He reached out on his own more than once, without Chelsea, asking if we could grab lunch together, just the two of us. During those lunches, he apologized again, this time without asking me to make anything go away or downplay what had actually happened that day. He admitted he'd let Chelsea's worry over her brother pull him into pressuring me in a way he wasn't proud of looking back, and that watching that coffee hit me and seeing me sitting there burned at my own table had been the exact moment. Everything about that pressure finally looked as ugly to him as it truly was. I told him I appreciated hearing all of that, and that I still loved him, but that trust between us would need to rebuild slowly, the same way any broken trust does, through steady, consistent actions over time, rather than through one single conversation over lunch. Chelsea and I spoke exactly once, right after her court proceedings wrapped up. A short, careful conversation where she thanked me, a little awkwardly, for not pushing the prosecutor toward a harsher outcome than the one she ended up with. I told her honestly that I hoped the counseling classes helped her, and that I hoped someday down the road we could sit at a table together again without either one of us flinching, but that when that day came was no longer only up to me, and that some doors take a while longer to open again, especially the ones that get slammed shut that hard. I started seeing Owen and Maddie regularly again, usually with just Kevin bringing them by on Saturday afternoons. And slowly, those two upstairs bedrooms filled back up with the sound of two kids playing video games and building pillow forts, exactly the way those rooms were always meant to be used in the first place. It's been almost a year now since that Thanksgiving, and my life looks different than it did back then. Quieter in some ways, a little fuller in others. The burn scar on my thigh has mostly faded, just a slightly lighter patch of skin now, unless you know exactly where to look for it. Though I've noticed Kevin's eyes drift toward my legs sometimes when we're talking, like he's remembering something he'd rather not think about. The trust Patricia set up for Owen and Maddie is still in place, still entirely under my control while I'm around to use it, and I've made my peace with the fact that protecting it wasn't cold or selfish of me. It was simply responsible, exactly the kind of thing Dorothy would have wanted me to do for our grandkids, without a single ounce of guilt attached to it. I finally finished restoring that old dresser out in the garage and moved it into the guest room upstairs this spring. And some Saturday afternoons, Owen helps me change the oil in the truck, while Maddie sits on the porch steps, sketching in the notebook I bought her for her birthday. Kevin and I are rebuilding something real between us, slower than either one of us would probably like, but real all the same. Brick by brick, instead of just pretending everything was fine the way we used to. I never went looking for revenge that Thanksgiving night. Not really. Not in the dramatic way people usually mean when they use that word. All I ever wanted was for my own home, my own safety, and my own choices to finally be respected by the people who were supposed to respect them more than anybody else. And sometimes, protecting yourself calmly, honestly, and through the proper legal channels is the only kind of justice that actually holds up over time. If you stayed with me all the way to the end here, thank you for listening to my story. And if any part of it hit close to home, drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Sister, brother, friend, whoever you are out there listening tonight. Hit that like button and subscribe for more, because I've got plenty more of these stories to tell you.